I get a little froggy or have to pause and cough, I'm on the upswing from a cold. Um, so I am really excited to talk with you all today about beavers in Wisconsin. It is true I can talk about beavers all day, but I promise I won't go beyond my allotted time, and I will save time for Q&A. On the topic of Q&A, I've given these kinds of presentations a lot, and so there are quite a few questions that I know I'm going to get, and I have slides for them at the end. So I'd like to hold the Q&A to the end. So if you see something on a slide and you're like, oh, I want to ask about that, just make yourself a little note, or if you need to, send it to Sean or one of the moderators, and they can just hold on to that in case you forget and need to tell me a question was asked that you've forgotten. So, what I really want to focus on today is balancing benefits of beavers with conflict management. I am going to be the first person to tell you that beavers are really chaotic and really stubborn and can be hard to work with, but I'm also going to be the first person to tell you that in many cases it's worth the effort. So that was a great introduction, and I wanted to make sure, in case there was anyone who didn't know who I am or my background. So I am an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. This is my 7th year as a professor, so fingers crossed I'll be an associate next year. My background as an undergraduate, I double majored with physics and chemistry at Carleton College down in Minnesota. And then I got my PhD in geological sciences with certificates in hydroscience and college teaching from the University of Colorado Boulder. I have been studying beavers exclusively since 2015. My projects that are not beavers are extremely adjacent to beavers. So I have put quite a bit of time into understanding them, the nuances of them, and critically, I really do take them at a continental scale when I try to understand them and pay a lot of attention to where there are regional differences and where there are not, and trying to understand the underlying biophysics of that. I lead a team of 14 researchers at the University of Minnesota, and every single one of my researchers also studies beavers. So we have quite a bit of knowledge generation of different perspectives and backgrounds and experiences coming to the team to try to understand beavers in the Great Lakes region and around the world. I have been doing this for a long time, and I talk about beavers a lot, so I am recognized as an expert on beaver impact and ecology. I'm not an expert necessarily on topics outside of that, so I do know a lot about trout. I am a trout fisherman, but I am not an international expert on trout. So when I'm talking, I'm coming from my place of beaver knowledge. Prior to all of this beaver stuff, I did work as a weapons engineer, which is just a fun fact. I was an engineer too, but I didn't build wetlands, I build weapons. And I've also lived in the Midwest for about 2/3 of my life, mostly Indiana, Michigan, and Minnesota. And I really love these landscapes, care deeply about them, and I'm quite personally invested in seeing them persist in a healthy way in the future. So let's do just like a brief beaver chat. And I know everyone here has been chatting about beavers for quite a while and probably doesn't need an in-depth Beavers 101, but I like to start with this anyways because it shows you how I'm understanding a beaver created landscape or beaver modified landscape. So we call them nature's engineers quite frequently, and that's because they're very powerful when it comes to transforming landscapes. What you're seeing is a really classic example of a low gradient beaver dammed area. We have a variety of vegetation on site. We have quite a few pine trees. We have cottonwoods. We have reeds. We have shrubs. We have grasses. We have aquatic vegetation. There is fast water, there is slow water, there's deep water, shallow water, warm water, cold water. It is a mosaic, and that is going to be the theme of beaver wetlands throughout what I'm talking about today, is that so much of what they create is complexity and mosaics, and how those mosaics manifest does vary from place to place, but in the end, it's always going to be patchy and messy. This is what the majority of North America, especially up here in the Upper Great Lakes region, looked like for quite a long time. Beavers have been engineering landscapes in North America for 7.5 million years. That could be as long as 24 million years. It is sometime between those two dates. We don't know exactly when, but that's the range. Even if it's only the wee 7.5 million years, that is significantly longer than we've been building dams. And it also helps me to think about beavers not necessarily just as an ecological force, but also as a geologic force. They have been working on the timescales of tectonics. They've been working on the timescales of erosion, of meander, of braiding. And they've also been working on these spatial scales. So prior to colonization and prior to westward expansion, there were 100 to 400 million beavers in North America. And for a little bit of context, that's about 1 billion beaver dams. I have worked as an engineer. I've worked in river restoration as well. It is such a pain to get a permit to build a single dam, even a little bitty one. And if we were going to get a permit to build 1 billion dams in North America, we would never get that permit. And we would never get it because we know how big of a deal that is. We know how dramatic changing the waters would be if we built 1 billion dams. But that's what was in North America. It was shaping our continent for millions and millions of years. And the beavers moved around. As ice sheets came down, they moved further south. As ice sheets left, they immediately recolonized. We're seeing this process again in the Arctic as the permafrost thaws and it turns back into a forest and back into grasslands. That beavers are right behind it. They're doing what they've always done, which is moving into the most marginal habitat they can find and transforming it. Now, today's marginal habitats are not necessarily because an ice sheet just left, it's because they are degraded. So this stream that I've shown you in a little drawing on the bottom left is a pretty classic stream in North America. It looks nice when you visit some of these. They're really easy to access. You can walk right up to the edge. They're quite shallow. There's not a lot of plants. It's not super muddy. It makes it very pleasant for people. But when they are this way, when they are cut away from their floodplain, when they are not interacting with the vegetation, when the water moves through too quickly, faster than it should have, it doesn't really support an ecosystem. A lot of our land has gotten this way through overgrazing, through development, and through intentional wetland draining. We do drain quite a bit of our wetlands. We are down about 50% of our historic wetlands in the Great Lakes region. So even though there's still a lot of water, and we're definitely doing better than California, which has lost 90% of its wetlands, we're still down about half. And those wetlands were somewhere before, and they could be there again today if we make room. Restoring them ourselves is very expensive. Typical river restoration costs can easily hit $1 million a mile when people do it. It's not cheap, and it's a big effort, and it's a big lift, and it's skilled work. But we are not the only skilled workers, and we are certainly the most expensive skilled workers because beavers also do this. Now, when a beaver builds a dam, I want to be extraordinarily clear that that dam is leaky. Water is always flowing through it, over it, under it, around it. It is not going to stop the water. It is just going to slow it down a bit. And depending on the dimensions of the dam and the surrounding landscape, the amount of slowing can be quite significant or almost nothing. Beavers don't stop when they build one little dam. This is one of the reasons why they're pretty challenging for us to live with and work with and plan around. They're going to expand it. They want that dam to be longer and taller and stronger. They want to hold back more water. And all of this is because even though they are semi-aquatic, they really are an aquatic animal. A beaver on the land is very vulnerable to its predators. An adult beaver can weigh anywhere from 40 to 110 pounds. And congrats, Wisconsin, the 110-pounder is from your state. So you hold that record. They can be huge, though. And the older they are, the bigger they get. It is not uncommon to have beavers that are 60 to 80 pounds up here. I have seen them. I have helped move beavers that are 60 to 80 pounds, and it is difficult because they're massive. So all of this work is to make themselves a large aquatic habitat. As they do this, it starts to create a wetland patch. And I want to emphasize patch. You can have a lot of beaver dams together, and it might be a very large patch, but ultimately beavers are a patchy process on the landscape. Now, beavers, as I just described, are large and awkward, and they also don't like to go up and down their dams. It is uncomfortable for them. They'll make slides to go up and down, which are like little divots that they pack extra mud on and lay the sticks in a different orientation so it doesn't poke them in their bellies as they slide up and down. But that's a lot of work, and it's not always going to be the best way to navigate the landscape. So the other thing they do is dig canals. Beavers evolutionarily could dig long before they could do any of the dam building or anything else. This has always been one of their strong suits. And these canals are extremely important. For the beaver, this is their highway system. These are their city streets. This is how they get around. If there's a predator, they can jump in and swim home to safety. They can float their logs back home after they cut them, a strategy that I do wonder how much inspiration we got from beavers when we became the world's best loggers. So they're doing all of this work, and it increases the connectivity of the habitat for the beaver. It also increases the connectivity of the habitat for the fish, the frogs, the turtles, all of the worms, all of the little things that also need water to move around. And this is something that is really starting to come into vogue in the scientific realm. More and more people are studying these canals. There is probably a 50-year span where all the focus for beaver research was on the dams, and only in the last 5 to 10 are we really starting to think, well, what about the canals? What do they do? And what we're finding is that they move everything around, and that fish will use them to bypass the dams, beavers will use them to bypass the dams. They're absolutely packed with frogs. They are critically a very dynamic habitat where at high water they're very full, at low water they could drain. There's always a lot going on there, which makes it extraordinarily rich. Now, to make sure everyone has the terms nailed down, the beaver dam, that's what's holding back the pond, completely separate structure than the beaver lodge. Very rarely will a beaver build its lodge attached to its dam. I've seen it a handful of times. They strongly prefer them separate, and that's because they need the dam to be able to break without endangering their lodge. It is a very big risk to them if they build them together, and will only do that in certain specific flow conditions where they think that that's the best option. You've got canals in the back. I'll also call these beaver channels. Sometimes you'll see them both in the literature. We've got the beaver family, mom beaver, dad beaver, mate for life. They are pretty monogamous species, although reproductively they can be non-monogamous sometimes. Even so, they live in very tight family units. These are sometimes called colonies. The family unit is going to be somewhere between 4 and 10 beavers on average. They have their babies once per year. 1 to 6 kits is average. We expect half of them to make it to adulthood based on historic data. So we're seeing about 50% survival to the adulthood mark, and then we continue to lose them, especially during their dispersing year, when they're out trying to be a beaver for the first time, usually at age 2 or 3. Now, beavers make a big impact. I am not going to pretend they don't. You're seeing a drone video right now of 2 of my human research assistants on top of a beaver lodge, and this is up in northern Minnesota. You got that one beaver dam that's cutting through the image now. Second one's about to come in on the right-hand side. It's a big influence. These beaver dams are on a trout stream. These beaver dams are 2 out of approximately 10 that this family has built and is maintaining. So this is one family controlling 1 to 2 kilometers of stream, which is a very typical beaver territory size. It is a lot going on, but what I want to point out, especially from this aerial view, is that even though these dams are large, you can see the water flowing over them. You can see the breaks in them where water is constantly moving. You can see all of the canals, and you can see that they don't just fan outwards, they connect to one another. They make a spider web of water. It's very, very integrated, and this is a classic beaver complex. And what's really key here is it does take time to get to this state. You don't get this overnight. And in places where beavers haven't been for a while, when they come back, there will be a curve for it to get to this state. There will be a period of time where the canals are not fully developed. There'll be a period of time where the dams are maybe not in the best shape. But once you go beyond year 1 into years 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, that's when you start to see the dynamic wetland, and that's when you start to see the benefits really pile on. There are absolute benefits in year 1, do not get me wrong, but they do continue to build. And there was just a really good study out of Norway, I believe, that looked at 54 years of a beaver dammed area as it was full of water, drained, full of water, drained, full of water, drained, and they found that the benefits to biodiversity were cumulative. And so you would get a benefit in year 5, and then it would have more benefits piled on top by year 10, and then more by year 15. And that some species were more cyclic with their use of the beaver pond. Certain water beetles didn't want it when it was too deep of water. They only wanted it when it was shallow. But because the beaver ponds were in and out of their own full or drained state, they were continuously providing habitat on the time scales of ecology. Some species just loved it all the time. The moose were just continuously benefiting from these ponds. So it's not like everybody needs it to be drained or full. Some of them like it in both states. And so looking at this from another angle, I want to point out that even though this complex is large, there are parts of it, even in between some of these dams, that do narrow back down and that do have faster flowing water, and that things like sediment are finite. You only have so much that is in the system, and if you are settling a bunch out in your beaver ponds, what that means is that there is less downstream, and that can make even better spawning gravels and things like that. I really push for us to take the landscape scale view or the watershed scale view when we think about beavers and beaver management, because that's the scale beavers engineer at. They don't engineer at the pond scale, they engineer at the complex scale, and beaver populations engineer at the watershed scale. So with beavers being so big and powerful and influential, obviously beaver management plans are extremely important. A lot of places have thought about beaver management. I'm just showing you some screenshots of a few of them here. And I want to highlight that there's a whole guide that came out this past year on beaver management planning. where the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, which is a hunting and angling organization, worked with the National Wildlife Federation to put together a guide about how do you make a good beaver management plan. What do you have to think about? Who do you have to involve? How do you balance benefits with conflicts? How do you respect the rights of trappers while still making sure that beavers are being harvested in a sustainable way? It's a really good resource. I highly recommend. If anybody doesn't have access, I have the PDF of it. I can send it whenever. I think it's a very good read. And it tries to take a very high-level view to make sure that everybody can feel like they are part of this planning process, because that's ultimately one of the most important things. If you just mandate about a species that is very polarizing, it generally does not go super well. And so there's also lots of plans that can be looked at to see how other places have thought about beaver and beaver conflict and beaver management. There's quite a few states that have plans. There's also quite a few regional and local plans and tribal plans. I have seen a draft of the EA related to the Beaver Management Plan rework in Wisconsin, and I did just want to point out that there are some more plans that weren't listed here, and in case they are of interest for review, I'm happy to send them along. It is difficult to dig these plans out of the mini archives of where they get stored, so I just wanted to provide this as a resource. There are a lot of plans out there of varying ages. Some of them were written in the early 2000s, some of them were just written last year, and in California, Colorado, and New Mexico, these are currently in progress, and I am part of writing some of these plans. So I have personal experience with this and know just how fun it is. And that is said with some sarcasm. It's not a super fun process. So Wisconsin obviously has a beaver management plan. There's the 2015 to 2025 plan that is getting revised. There are also the beaver control guidelines for people with beaver damage. That is a document that is out there to help guide people. And I'll say I've read both of these in a lot of detail, and they do a really good job of describing a smart order of events. First, think about if this is real conflict. Second, explore non-lethal management. Third, try to figure out some sort of a solution, because lethal management probably isn't going to be long-term. Fourth, pursue lethal if you have to. I think this is great, and I like to read that. However, it's not always being communicated outwards that this is the plan, and this is one of those social dimensions that I think could use some more attention in Wisconsin. I also think that not everyone is adhering to this plan, and this is true in every state. What's written is not always what's done, and as that builds, that's where you start to get mistrust. I've been part of this process in many places, and trust is so important. You have to have trust between the anglers and the advocates. You have to have trust between the trappers and the conservationists, and if it feels like people are not being honest with one another, then it's genuinely a non-starter. There are a couple things in these documents that I wanted to point out that have been brought to my attention by others as things that they have a problem with the documents. The first thing, and I'm sure everyone's heard this one many times, Wisconsin does use explosives fairly regularly for dam removal. And this is a method of dam removal that is quite complete when it is used. As a geologist and as a hydrologist, I can tell you that beaver dams are built to withstand extraordinary floods. There's quite a bit of research in the peer-reviewed literature showing that they can withstand 100-year, 500-year massive flood events, 2 meters of rain in 3 days, and not fully wash out. When we blast them all at once, and this isn't just a Wisconsin thing, I've had this conversation with several different places, what we're doing is we're simulating a 1,000-year flood. And we're doing that every single year. And we are releasing massive amounts of sediment, and we are destabilizing banks, and it's not the way to do it. And one thing that is in this document is that explosives are recommended over hand tools and over less destructive removal techniques. And I've had people express concern about that because we don't typically think about using explosives in sensitive habitat. And I can tell you from my own experience as someone who has worked professionally with explosives, I would not use these in a riparian zone where I'm concerned about the species that are living there. I would be very careful, because when you have accumulated sediment, especially behind a beaver pond, there's a lot in there. There's a lot of biogeochemistry happening. There's a lot of heavy metals that have been sunk out and are in the process of being buried. And there was a good study that came out of Colorado that found when you do a complete dam removal, you will mobilize it all. It'll all start moving downstream, and we have enough pollution. But if you notch the dam, if you remove it more slowly, you don't necessarily have that mobilization event. So I'm not saying the dams can't be removed. Sometimes dams have to be removed, but how we do it really matters. This one I know also comes up quite a bit and it's difficult to change, but not needing a permit to remove beaver dams from your neighbor's land. I've given a number of talks now at supper clubs in Wisconsin and at community events in Wisconsin, and I have had people come tell me that their neighbor took out their beaver dam and they have just terrible relationship with their neighbor now because that was where they birdwatched, or that was where they fished, or that was where they had their breakfast, and the pond is gone, and now it's a mud flat, and it's not recovering the way they want because the beavers can't come back. And this is the kind of thing that makes people against each other. And it doesn't need to be this way. Even if you don't need a permit to remove a dam from a neighbor's land, I think there's a lot of room to formalize a permission process or at least a notification process. I talked to folks up in near Hayward at a supper club, and they said that they didn't even have warning. They woke up one day and it was gone. And they talked to their neighbor, and their neighbor said, "Yep, I took it out. You can't do anything about it." And that's not a good place to build relationships from. The other thing that gets brought up a lot is the age of the literature. Unlike a fine wine, literature doesn't always age well. And this is true in a lot of places. And in a lot of these guidelines that had been previously published, a large amount of the citations were to studies from the 1960s through the 1980s. Not to say that these studies don't have value. Some of them definitely do. However, I've also read quite a few of these studies, and some of them would not make it through peer review today. And some of them did not make it through peer review in the past. There is more research that's being done, and it's being done at the colleges and universities. It's being done in the DNR. It's being done in your sister states and their colleges and universities and their DNRs with similar landscapes and similar problems. And so even if the literature says the exact same thing, citing modern research alongside this foundational research is going to do a lot to build trust that we've done our work. We have actually looked to see what is the state of the science and are not just leaning into what was being said and not looking to see if it's changed. Because things change. Things definitely change. All over the place, things change. That's the nature of science. As a scientist, one of my core philosophies is that I always need to be able to look back on my old findings and ask, is this still true? Because it might not be. I mentioned that other states have gone through this process, and so these are some barriers that were called out in a master's project that turned into a publication about what are the barriers to beaver management planning. And this, to be extremely clear, is not focused on Wisconsin. This was on a different state going through this process, but I think they did a really good job of identifying some of those socio-ecological factors that influence the planning process. So some of our human dimensional barriers is generational amnesia. This one's a really big one. Many people do not have a memory of living alongside beaver. Their parents do not have this memory. Their grandparents do not have this memory. This is a bigger problem here in Wisconsin than it is in California. Beavers weren't eradicated from most of California until the early 1800s, whereas beavers were heavily eradicated on the East Coast much sooner, and then the Midwest, and then the High Plains, and then out west. So it's been a while. And that's fine. We don't have that memory. The problem is if we're not willing to think about why we don't have that memory, or if that should be the memory. Because remember, beavers have been building for 7.5 million years. We also inherit our reactions and attitudes. So we learn from our communities that we're in, we learn from the people we talk to. This can change, and this is on both sides. If you come from a family of people that really love beavers, you're going to express that. And if you come from a family of people that really don't love them, you are going to express that. We can move past this barrier when people are more willing to talk to one another and not just lean into what they have heard. A classic human problem, and this could be listed as a barrier to any change, is that people are resistant to change. Everyone. Every single person is resistant because we fear the unknown and we're trying to do our best, and everything feels extremely high stakes right now. Because it is high stakes, climate's changing quite quickly, and we are facing a lot of extinction. We are facing a lot of problems in our environments, and we don't want to make the wrong choice because we care about these species. We care about beavers, we care about trout, we care about loons, we care about moose, we care about wolves, we care about all these different animals. We care about wild rice, we care about lily pads. Everything feels at risk right now. We want to manage it successfully, and it is hard to coexist. I'm not going to beat around the bush. It is not as easy as just killing the beaver and removing the dam. That is a very easy process. It is harder to coexist, but in many cases, it is worth it. Not all. In some places, it's just not going to work. But in some places, we need to be really strategic about that hassle and to lean into it. We also have a lack of knowledge, and there are a lot of misperceptions. A lot of times there's a lack of expertise support. Beavers are an interesting species because they are and have been considered a pest in many places for the last century for the most part. And so a lot of the literature comes from the lens of pest management. It is only in the last 20 to 30 years that we've really seen a shift from beavers as a pest, how do I manage them in the science, to beavers as an ecosystem engineer, beavers as a keystone species, beavers as just another animal that's doing things. And so the lack of expertise isn't necessarily because people ignore it, it's because it has been hard to find for quite a long time. And you can talk to any of the big names in the beaver science world who are towards the ends of their careers, and they'll tell you it's like a cycle. Beavers will come into fad, out of fad, into fad, out of fad. And what puts them out of fad is one bad PR story, and then nobody studies them for 10 years, and nobody funds studies on them for 10 years. Then we have a knowledge gap. We also lack pilot projects. People are nervous about saying, let's just try it and see what happens. And I think this is a place where Wisconsin can really be a leader. Out west, which a lot of people will bring up in conversation, and I fully acknowledge it is not the same here as out west. But out west, there are not enough beavers to do a before-after control study that involves lethal management. There are places where if you take out one family of beavers, you will depopulate the watershed. Wisconsin is not in that place. We do not have that bad of a situation with our beavers. And so we have a really strong opportunity to use our programs for management, to use our existing trapper base, to do really good, high quality studies about what happens when beavers are taken away and what happens when beavers come back and all these different timescales associated with it. Let's lean into those pilot projects and make sure they can be executed robustly. And if there's professional development needed, there are resources. How do you build a pond leveler? That can be taught. How do you build a culvert exclusion fence? That can also be taught. How do you use electric fencing to zap the beavers and keep them out of the orchard? That can also be taught. And people need to put a little bit of time into that because there are a lot of ecological benefits. Ecosystem services, they are native here. They do belong here. They were here in abundance before the fires and before the logging, and I'll come back to that. And we need to acknowledge that. And even if we acknowledge that and then say, yes, but nothing's changing, just having those acknowledgements, I think, goes a long way towards building goodwill. So I want to quickly highlight a couple of the most commonly asked about non-lethal options. So flooding is a big concern. We have a lot of water here, which is a great blessing, but it can also be a bit of a curse when the water goes where we don't want it, which includes on roads and people's driveways, basements, croplands, etc. We can put pipes through beaver dams. Beavers haven't figured out how to make their dam invincible to these pipes, so we're pretty good at this. We can also put notches in them and then fence the notch. This is a newer style of coexistence called notch exclusion fencing. I've installed some of these in Minnesota, and they are working great. The beavers are not damming on them. Their dam is maintaining its openness, and the water is flowing through it quicker, and the water level is lower. They are also a passageway for fish, if that is a concern, although I don't think it should be, and I'll come back to that. So these are great, and they're relatively cheap. They can last 5 to 10 years with minimal maintenance. Our biggest issues here in the upper Midwest is debris racking if you're on a lake system that already has lots of debris moving through it. But if you're going to be having that much debris moving through anyways, you're probably already clearing your debris somehow. And so now you're just clearing it off of the fence face instead of off of your culvert. I've done some of this debris clearing off of our exclusion fencing, and it is not particularly difficult to do. And I am not a particularly strong person, so I'm not out there like hulking a ton of material around. It's just a rake and an hour of your time. These are inexpensive. They're made out of stuff you can get at Menards or Home Depot, and they're ecologically integrated, which is key. When you put these in, you do not drain the wetland entirely. You drain it partially. And so you maintain some of that habitat and some of that complexity, and you also mitigate whatever flooding damage you are experiencing. Another thing that we have problems with is when beavers chew on our favorite trees. This is more common at the urban wildland interface or in urban spaces, period. So a beaver comes into your park, chews on your favorite tree, cuts it down, it's a problem. I worked with Carleton College down in southern Minnesota on some of these problems. The beavers were trying to access a memorial forest where the trees were planted for people. So that was not acceptable in any way. And it was a simple case of fencing those trees and then providing, by planting, some of the trees that beavers like a little bit closer to where we'd like the beavers to be. Problem was solved. We also know that tree fencing works. This paper from Sherry Westbrook up in Canada is a really good example where she looked at four different styles of fencing, including fencing in a way that we do not expect to work, with inappropriately weak wire at the wrong height. And even in that situation, it still worked. Not amazing, but it still worked. It was still deterring the vast majority of the beaver chewing. Beavers also prefer to chew on little bitty trees, not tiny baby trees. Those are bitter to them and they don't digest well. But once the tree is a young tree and it has full bark on it, the beaver will want to chew on that. So they usually aren't going to be cutting down your biggest, best prized old growth trees. It's also something that is wanted in Wisconsin, and it needs to be easier for people who want this to get this. I have done non-lethal installs in Minnesota, and I love working with our DNR. I love working with our hydrologists because it is a conversation with them, and it is a conversation with the property owners in the county. Can we put in a notch exclusion fence here? Can we put in a culvert protection device? And the local area hydrologist and the county people who are involved will look at it and say, yes, I think this is a good idea. Thumbs up. That's the process. And that has enabled us to be nimble. A beaver shows up and we can get one of these structures in right away. It has also enabled us to be really inclusive of the community when we're doing this planning. We can give a talk, pitch this as an option, the people vote, and then their vote is respected. It's not like the HOA says, yeah, let's give this a shot. And then 3 years later, the permit's issued and all the momentum is shot. So I know it is possible to install these in Wisconsin. I also know it is difficult. It is more difficult than a number of states. And this is a process that, if nothing else, could be reviewed and maybe figure out a set of scenarios where instead of going through the entire engineering design for these, you can do a fast track permit. If you trust landowners to take out beaver dams with explosives, I think it would be okay to trust landowners to put a pipe through the beaver dam or a notch through the beaver dam. Um, we don't know how many beavers there are in Wisconsin. I know that there are estimates from trapping data. I know there are some estimates from extrapolating off of aerial surveys, but the truth of the matter is we don't know. And we don't know where they are, and we don't know how it's changing. We don't know how it's responding to management actions. I think that it would be amazing if every state could monitor their beaver populations a little more closely, if for no other reason that beavers are extremely powerful, and you should know where they are. Or because they are a natural resource. Even if you only think about that in terms of fur, they are. So where are they? How are they responding to our actions? How are they responding to climate change? How are they responding to pollution, to disaster, to disease, if there is any? We just don't know. And adding monitoring in and making sure that true population monitoring, not just harvest counts, which are known to have biases in them, making sure even if there's just spot checking of checking your harvest count against an actual census, that's going to go a really long way for being able to look at your policies and say, this is fine. We removed 3,000 beaver dams and it was fine. It didn't do anything. We killed 30,000 beavers and it was fine. I think those statements can be said right now. I don't think that they can be backed up because there's just not data. When I worked on a policy in Oregon about their beaver, there was a lot of push for a trapping ban. There was a lot of push for a lot of things. And the stance I took in that situation was that all of that is too premature because we don't know how many beavers there are. The first step is to truly get counts. And if that means requiring take to be reported, even if it's a private land take, even if you're killing the beaver on your own property, every data point matters so that we can make policies that make sense and we can manage our resources just like we manage water or minerals or wood or anything else that is naturally occurring and susceptible to our actions. So why bother? That was a long part of me just saying you should do this and you should do that. What, why? Why should you do these things? Why should we do these things? I'm out there in the field too. I study them. I work on coexistence. I work with trappers. I have a lot of respect for all of this. Why do we bother? Why put in the effort? We put in the effort because climate is changing and our normal is not what it used to be. Every single century, every single decade, it's hotter. Looking at these maps, it is so much hotter. And it's ironic for me to say that today because at least in Minneapolis, we are cruising down to -20 tonight. But this is the first -20 I felt since I moved back 3 years ago. And that is reflective of the change because I felt it a lot more when I did my college education up here. So things are just getting hotter and hotter. It's not slowing down, it's not stopping. Temperature is a big stressor on a lot of ecosystems, and we need to make them resilient to that. Everything is changing with the temperature too. So our predictions for the Great Lakes region is that it is going to be wetter, but our winters will be shorter. We're going to have more rain, less snow, more rain on snow, and rain on frozen ground events, which really increases the likelihood that we have winter and spring stormwater problems. Our summers will be drier. We will not be in a drought per se year round, but with these super wet winters, we will then roll right into a nice hot, dry summer, and that makes us prone to things like fire, even though we didn't used to be. Everything is hotter, and our storms are worse. We are seeing 2.3 degrees of warming Fahrenheit, 16 days longer frost-free season, 14% more precip, and 35% heavier precipitation events. And this is the change that occurred between 1950 and 2017. This is the change that occurred between just before when some of those foundational Beaver papers were written and now almost 10 years ago. This is a lot of change. Even if everything that was written in the 60s was accurate, the whole context has changed. It needs to be restudied because the rest of the planet is not the same. Heat waves are not something that is a Western US problem. Heat waves are something that is an us problem. It is super warm. We are seeing our lakes not freeze over. We are seeing plants put out their buds during some of these heat waves in January and in December. It is damaging. It is killing trees. It is warming the water. We are seeing major changes to our hydrology. This is not getting better. So we have to focus on climate adaptation. We have to focus on making our landscapes resilient and resistant to the challenges we are facing, which is too much water at the wrong time on top of frozen ground and hot temperatures. All of those issues that felt like they were a Western US problem are creeping eastwards. We are seeing fire. We are seeing a lot of it. We are seeing droughts. We are seeing winter droughts, especially not enough snow, not enough rain. We are seeing flooding at a scale that is unrecognizable for many people. And that flooding is coming from the fact that there's nowhere for the water to go. If we had a ton of rain and we also had a lot more natural infrastructure to catch that rain and slow it down, we probably wouldn't see 1,800 homes being destroyed in Milwaukee. So we need to make our landscapes more climate resilient. And this is where the beaver comes in. And it can sound like an exaggeration to say, well, beavers can fix this. They can't fix all of it. There's a lot of problems that beavers cannot touch. And there's a lot of things that are solely our responsibility. But beavers can fix a lot. And beavers can be our partners if we let them in the places we need them. All of those behaviors they have, the dam building, the canal digging, the tree chewing, the wetland creation, the wetlands they make are more resistant to climate fluctuations than any other wetland type. And this is something I've studied. This is something my colleagues have studied. This is something my academic enemies have studied, and we're all finding the same answers. Their wetlands are really unique, and it's because there's that maintenance engineer on staff 24/7, 365, whose entire survival depends on having a dynamic, patchy wetland habitat. The complexity and all of that resilience actually starts during our flood period. So in this sense, Wisconsin is very well positioned because we have a lot of water sometimes. And in our simplified streams, that water is too much in too small of a space. But in our complex beaver patches, the whole thing doesn't have to be beaver, just patches. We have a lot more space for it to spread out. We have more vegetation to slow it down. And this is realized in every flood event, whether that's high water from the annual high water, if it's too much rain, if it's too much snow, if it's a dam breaking, doesn't really matter. When you put too much flood water in too small, too in size, too narrow, too simple of a stream, it's like when you put your thumb over the most of the top of the hose, and it goes from being a pretty nice, well-controllable stream of water into an aggressive and damaging spray. And that's exactly what we see. Our flood waves are ripping our streams apart. If we paid $1 million to restore this stream, it's now unrestored. And it is now, once again, vulnerable to even further incision or further damage or further bank erosion. And this won't stop because our floods won't stop. But what can stop the flood, at least the damage of the flood, is a wetland patch. We could have other wetland patches. They don't all have to be beaver. However, there's only two things that can make a wetland, and that's people and beaver. And people are pretty overtaxed, understaffed, and undersupported in our wetland creation. And so this is where we look strategically across the whole landscape and think, where would a couple wetland patches here protect downstream infrastructure, protect downstream habitat? Because instead of that flood wave ripping things apart, It takes the canals that so effectively move the beavers, it goes out to the floodplain, it sinks into the soil, and it still goes downstream, over the dam, under the dam, around it, and through it. And instead of seeing enormous scales of erosion and soil loss and scouring, we see water being spread out, stored, and slowed. And that's better because we can control water when it's been spread out, stored, and slowed. We can't control it when it's ripping through an unhealthy stream. And I want to make the hydrograph picture super clear for those of you that do work in hydrology. So we've got stream flow on our y-axis, the vertical, time in terms of the year, annual cycle on our x. And I've color-coded the first part of the year, that's winter. It's when our snow is usually accumulating. Summertime is peak plant water demands. And then you get into fire and drought danger in that late season when maybe we don't have quite as much precipitation coming due to our hotter, drier summers. So in the undammed stream or a structureless stream, it doesn't just have to be beaver dams. We're also pretty deficient in log jams, woody debris, etc. Water comes screaming down as fast as it can in snowmelt, and then it drops off. And then it's pretty low base flow the rest of the year. You add structures, beaver dams, log jams, etc., and it's going to smash that out. It's going to smooth it. We're going to push water into the later season, which is alarming because when you are used to seeing your stream roaring in May and June, and it is not roaring, you will feel like you do not have as much water, and that's a bad feeling, and you want to figure out how to fix it. But you have to wait because you look downstream and you wait until it's summertime and we still have water flowing at a higher rate than we would during that typical undammed stream scenario. And it's not always such a dramatic smearing. I mean, I made this very significant differences for visual purposes. Sometimes it's just a little. Sometimes it just lengthens that flowing season just a bit. But this matters. We've seen stranding events. We've seen disconnection hydrologically in Minnesota, especially along our streams, where the only water habitat available is beaver ponds. And that is an important thing. That is a refugia effect. And at that point, the fish probably would prefer to have some water, even if it's a little warm, than to have no water at all. And spoiler, the water was not warm in those ponds. So the total water volume is the same. The beavers aren't stealing the water. They're not hogging the water. There's no rights issues here. There's a little bit of water recharge that goes into groundwater, but most of that will come back to the stream through springs. So it's more like a reduce, reuse, recycle than a destruction or a stealing. When you think about that with depth now into the soil, in our stream without beavers, as long as we have that rain, the plants really don't care. Everything's green and healthy and happy. With the beavers, a lot more complexity. Every canal is like a microstream, so your connection between groundwater and surface water is much stronger, which is important because our groundwater is exceptionally cold. So if we can enhance that connection, if we can make sure groundwater stays connected and that we haven't drawn it down away through our aquifer depletion and pumping, which we've done quite a bit of, that connection will maintain the cold water environment and out cold, I guess, any kind of benefits that would be lost through tree cutting by beavers, per se. It also matters a lot because you get drought conditions, and now everyone needs to reach soil water, and not everybody can. If you've got beavers, they certainly can. This is something I've studied out west. This is something my colleagues have studied in the boreal. It's true in both places. Beaver wetlands are uniquely resistant to drought. They provide drought refugia, thermal refugia, and habitat, even when everywhere else is going dry. And of course, what comes after drought? Fire. And if it's too wet to feel that drought, it is also then too wet to burn. I know fire is not the primary concern of Wisconsin, and for that I'm glad. It's becoming one of our primary concerns in Minnesota. We had wicked fires last spring, and we'll see if we have them again this year. Hopefully not. But if we do, I feel reassured knowing that some of my favorite places have a lot of beaver, and that these beaver dams and wetlands can significantly alter fire behavior. They can also just provide a patch of habitat that survives. And everything in it survives too. The fish, the frogs, the turtles, the birds, the small mammals, the people, the plants, the rice, the trees, and it's there to repopulate the surrounding landscape. That's the nucleus of recovery in events that can be extraordinarily destructive. And if this is not something that resonates with you or with your stakeholders or with your communities, they are valuable in terms of the monetary sense too. When we think about all the things beavers provide, recreational hunting and fishing opportunities, greenhouse gas sequestration, water supply, water quality improvements, moderation of extreme events exclusive of fire, this study was pre-fire work, habitat and biodiversity provisioning, and non-consumptive rec, and then also we can't even put a dollar sign on their historical and cultural value, but that is in here too. It is $179,000 per square mile engineered per year as of 2020. And it's a lot more expensive now than 2020. And fire is a concern now. So I would estimate that this dollar sign should probably be north of $200,000 per square mile per year. We don't need this everywhere. This doesn't work everywhere. But there are a lot of places this does work where we are not letting it work for us. Engineers can cost $179,000 a year, easy. And I'm not saying we should unemploy our human engineers. I think that we should have our brilliant brains working in the landscapes beavers cannot. Our forests are also unhealthy. Our prairies are also struggling. Let's put our minds to the places that beavers are not in charge of, and rest assured that the beavers can keep our rivers healthy. I want to highlight a couple of ecosystem services that I think are particularly important in Wisconsin. Number one is water quality. There are challenges with water quality from agriculture, from mining, from pollution in the cities, from cows, and beavers can help with that. They can be used strategically. There's a really good study that just came out this past year that found that up to 95% of E. coli is removed from the water column as it travels through a beaver wetland. It is getting bound up onto fine sediments, it's sinking to the bottom, is getting buried. If it doesn't sink to the bottom, it's getting stuck on the dam and buried. And that means the downstream water is healthier. We've had a lot of our public beaches closed in Minneapolis for over a population of E. coli, and that sucks. And I think we should get some beavers in there because I want to be able to swim and paddleboard. I don't want to be thinking about how nasty the water is. They also are really good at storing metals, heavy metals, arsenic, lead, cadmium. Similar, a lot of these will be binding onto fine sediments or sinking out on their own. And then they are at the bottom of the pond and they are buried over time. And if you're like, burying isn't good enough, fair, but that's also how we deal with most of our pollution is we bury it. We put it in drums and we bury it. So this is just another way to remove it from the ecosystem and to take it from a very active form into an inert form. What some of these studies have found, though, is that if you blow up the dam all at once, you will release it all. You will undo it. If the dam breaks slowly, that will not happen. They're also great at removing those agricultural pollutants, so that's nitrates, phosphates, things like that. This matters for our harmful algal blooms. This matters for water quality. This matters for a lot of species that can't handle having that excess nutrient pulse. The nitrate gets processed in the soils through biogeochemistry that results in denitrification, so turning it back to inert nitrogen gas. The phosphates tend to bind onto the fine sediment and get deposited on the floodplain where they're accessed by the plant roots, and so they are used as intended as a fertilizer, but instead of being for crops, it is for your riparian corridor. We also know that biodiversity is super important, and we have seen biodiversity increased around beaver wetlands around the world. And it is not just for one type of animal, it is not just for one animal of interest. They are increasing the habitat quality for trout. They are increasing the habitat quality for birds, for bees, for butterflies, for pollinators, for bats. They are doing an incredible amount of work to make it good habitat for everyone. And that matters because we are losing species at an incredible rate. And so bringing back biodiversity, even just in patches, can be the difference between extinction or not for some species. So it's time for us to be better about collecting data. I mentioned that some of these studies are quite old. They get referenced a lot in this region. I'm doing a large literature review project as part of a National Science Foundation grant right now, and my region is the Midwest. And so I've been looking for every single thing that's been written about beavers in the Midwest and trying to categorize what they found, what were their methods, how did it look. And I can tell you there's just not a lot. It's a void. What's out there is largely not peer-reviewed. Not everything has to be peer-reviewed, to be clear, but that is the standard in science, and it has not been met in many cases here. So we need to get better. We need to do 3D temperature maps. We need to stop just putting the temperature sensor at the top of the water column and saying it's hot. We know that's hot. Everybody knows that. When you go into the water and you touch the surface, it's warm. When you go down to the bottom of the pools, it's cold. And that's the case. So when we study temperature, let's get profiles. Let's get three-dimensional maps. We have the technology. I love the technology. I'm happy to talk about how to do that with anyone. Coming up with technological instrumentation is one of my interests. We also need to think about the type of context we're in. Is it a drought? Is it a flood? Is it in normal conditions? Is it spring? Is it summer? Is it winter? How is the role of beavers different in the winter than the summer? We don't know. We focus so heavily on summer that we often forget about that winter habitat and how critical it is for things like rearing and overwintering. We need to look at nutrient and pollutant response across complexes, not point data. We need to do before-after controlled impact studies on lethal management, on coexistence. I have suspicions that putting in pond levelers probably does change the scale of some of the benefits we get from beavers, but I don't know how much yet. So I am doing research on that now. I have an artificial stream that I'm working with at the St. Anthony Falls lab, where we will be testing rigorously what changes when you put in a pond leveler. What if it's this diameter? What if it's this diameter? We're going to answer these questions scientifically so I can go out there confidently and say, when you put this in, it'll change your flooding by X, it'll increase your blot risk by Y. Let's put some math and numbers behind our feelings. We also need to get real about the actual historic conditions. There were a lot of beavers here. There were a ton of beavers in North America. There's a reason why fur was such a big deal here, and it was beavers. I want to point out a study from 2012 by Kemp et al., who looked at the effects of reintroduced beavers on stream fish. This one gets cited a lot. And I like to point out something that they did that I really appreciate, which is go through all these papers and all these statements about positive impacts and negative impacts, and then count how many of those statements are actually driven by data versus speculative. So I'm on the positive impacts right now, and these are as of 2012. So there's 13-ish years of more data since then that isn't included. So take this with a grain of salt. But what's highlighted in green now are the positive impacts that are majority data driven. Enhanced habitat availability and complexity, enhanced overwintering habitat, enhanced diversity species richness, enhanced abundance productivity, provision of temperature refuge, enhanced invertebrate productivity, enhanced growth rates, enhanced fish conditions. Now on to the negatives. Altered flow regimes is more than 50% data-driven. Abandonment of beaver settlements, more than 50% data-driven. Reduced water quality, retarded growth, and reduced oxygen levels are 50-50. So they are not either way. But some of the ones I hear the most: barriers to fish movement, reduced spawning habitat, altered temperature regime, reduced habitat quality, loss of cover, reduced productivity, are majority speculative. This isn't to criticize people making these speculations. This is to point out a data need. So when we are thinking about managing beaver and writing beaver management plans, we should write in a need for science. We should mandate to our colleges, to our universities, to our nonprofits to study this. Let's stop saying things. Let's find answers that have data to back them up, because we have to. We don't want to manage our species of interest to extinction. So now is my but what abouts. This is where everybody asks me the same questions. I'm going to quickly hit on them, and then I'll take your questions that are hopefully not identical to these ones. But what about brook trout? They love beaver ponds. We snorkel in the beaver ponds, and the fish I see in there the most is brook trout. They love all of that woody debris. They love hanging out in those deep pools. They are ice cold. Beavers preferentially dig on top of springs to bring that cold water into their ponds. Beavers also don't like to be warm. There's a reason they love the north so much. And that is a benefit to all these cold water lovers as well. What about warm water? There's an outstanding amount of research coming from the Western United States showing that we get cold water. There are warm water spots, absolutely. The margins, warm. That's ideal for those frogs that love the beaver ponds too. The pools, cold. That's ideal for our cold water species. And if you don't want to rely on out west data, you don't have to. There have now been enough studies in Minnesota looking at temperature, and some studies in Wisconsin looking at temperature, finding the same thing. It is not significantly warming. If you look at an individual pond scale, if you just measure the surface, if you just measure your shallowest spots, it will look really warm. But if you take a temperature profile with depth, your pools are cold. What about silt and sediment accumulating? If we manage our streams to be all spawning habitat, all fast-running water, all rocky, cobbly, gravelly stuff, then there is not habitat for resting and feeding and growing. That is not good for the trout. They need to have places to be both doing their egg laying, as well as hanging out, eating, and not being stressed by fast-flowing water with no cover. So when you add those wetland patches, don't sacrifice everything to the beavers, but let them come back in a patchy way. You are having a mixture of that spawning habitat, as well as the resting, feeding, and growing habitat. Remember, a finite amount of silt and sediment comes through here, and if it's being caught behind your beaver ponds, your fish should probably be smart enough to go do their spawning somewhere else, and then come back to the pond when they want to hide under the branches, not get eaten by predators, not have to swim against a fast current, gorge on all of the fish food that they could possibly want, and become a gigantic fish. Because what is really well supported in the literature is that brook trout that come out of beaver ponds are much larger than those that do not. What about disease? Poor beavers and beaver fever. They're always blamed for Giardia, which makes sense. In the 1980s, the term beaver fever was coined after a group of backpackers in Banff drank the water from the bottom of a beaver pond and got terribly ill. The take-home story is don't drink sediment-laden water. There's always Giardia in it. The vast majority of the waterways in the United States have Giardia in them. There's a reason we don't drink unfiltered water. An interesting re-examination of that event in 2004 went and did genetic analyses on all the Giardia from beaver ponds, especially from the beaver fever event. And what is fascinating is that they found that beavers are more likely to become infected with Giardia that came from humans, dogs, and cows than for beavers to infect human, dog, and cow with Giardia. One of the things that's unfortunate about beavers is they can share the same strains of Giardia as us. And so when we are filling the water with it, because we are letting our cows poop right on the edge of the stream, it will make the beavers sick. Luckily, they're very resistant to it, so it'll mostly just stay in them, stay in their poops, which goes straight to the pond bottom. There are other concerns that people have about diseases, things like tularemia. I can tell you that tularemia is terrible in the beaver world because it can depopulate a watershed like that. It kills the beavers extremely rapidly. They do not get it often, and when they do, it's coming from rabbits most of the time. What about if a beaver doesn't have its favorite foods or building materials? Maybe they don't belong in parts of the state because it's prairie or it's something else. Well, beavers don't just eat bark from their favorite trees. They eat grasses, reeds, lilies, aspens, cottonwoods, birch, maple, alder, spruce, dogwood, buckthorn, berry bushes, sap, and more. Beavers are generalists. They can eat a lot of different things. They for sure have preferences. But beavers wouldn't be able to live in the deserts of Mexico if they needed boreal trees. They wouldn't be able to live in the tundras of the Arctic if they needed to have full-size boreal trees. They couldn't live in Nevada. They couldn't live in the prairies. And yet they do, and they always have. And so beavers are very adaptable with their food sources and with their building materials. They can build with just about anything they can eat, but then also mud, rocks, bones. There's documented peer-reviewed evidence of beavers building their dams entirely with stones in the Yukon and prioritizing the shrubs for their food. So they're clever. They'll make it work. If you see a landscape and you think, I don't think it should have beavers, it's too many pine trees, it's too many conifers. That's not true. Beavers live in many coniferous forests because they engineer the riparian zone to have enough material for them to eat and build with. And they also do use spruce for what it's worth. Quite heavily, I might say. What about lack of predators? Baby beavers can get eaten by just about anything. Every mesopredator can take out a baby. They're born the size of a sweet potato, and they're quite vulnerable. People, eagles, owls, predatory fish, foxes, bobcats, coyotes, wolves, bears, mountain lions, essentially every meso or megapredator can eat them. It takes them a long time to grow. By the time they're an adult leaving home, they've maybe hit 30 pounds. Once they're an adult and they keep growing, though, start cascading towards their upper weight limit, their main issues are going to be people, coyotes, if they're a good coyote, wolves, bears, mountain lions, and then other beavers. They're extremely territorial. Beavers kill other beavers all the time for invading their territories. The most common injury we see on beaver tails are chunks missing from other beavers biting them. And those chunks can get infected and the beaver dies. So there's not really a concern about overpopulation. The beavers are very self-regulating, and they will not allow an overdensification of beaver to occur. I also want to point out that there is a geography to predation. When beavers are predated by animals, it is across the landscape. It is in many different places. The dams are not removed by the predator, typically. You don't have a wolf go eat the beaver, then dig out the dam. And so it's a really different process, biophysically, than when we do targeted eradication, when we pick streams that we want to remove all the beavers and all the dams from. The environmental impact of natural predation, and this is oftentimes recreational trapping as well, where it's being done here and there, and it's not done with an intention to depopulate. That's a really different and often quite sustainable way of losing beaver, whereas targeted eradication is not. And that's what can make our streams really unhealthy and our populations unhealthy. Not just of beavers, but of other species that rely on that wetland habitat. What about fish passage? If I haven't hammered on it enough, I'll hammer on it again. This is largely a non-issue. When fish want to move, they often can pass beaver dams, through them, over them, around them, under them. This is studied in many places. This is being heavily studied in the UK right now, with a lot of interesting and modern technologies, including eDNA, pit tagging, cameras, and they are finding that beavers are not impeding the movement of fish. And there are times when they will, and it will be during your droughts when the water is really low and it's disconnecting. And during those times, your fish will be seeking refuge in the deep pools that they can find in the beaver ponds, which has been observed in Montana and California and many places around the world. What about too many beavers? Too many beaver ponds? What about flat landscapes with too many beaver ponds? I'd say look north to your neighbors in Ontario, who also love their brook trout and those populations of them. And they call out specifically on their government website what they need in habitat: year-round supply of cold, clear water, plenty of cover from branches, logs, and rocks, streams with cool, quiet pools between the fast runs and rapids, clear, cold lakes, and beaver ponds. There are a lot of brook trout in Ontario. There are way more beavers in Ontario than here, and they're doing pretty well. What about just waiting a bit? What if we're uncertain? What if we're not sure if we're ready to act? I don't think we have time. Wisconsin is the 11th most at-risk state for biodiversity loss, and that is across the board. We are the 6th most at risk from overexploitation, leading to loss. We're taking our species out faster than they can recover. And when we are overexploiting our trout, when we're overexploiting animals, plants, habitats, that's going to make us lose these species faster. I don't think we have time to wait, full stop. I think we need to lean into pilot projects. I think we need to feel more comfortable experimenting and revisiting old views. And if that means doing a study and finding the exact same thing that Ed Avery found, great. Do the study, publish the results in the peer-reviewed literature. And if it means finding something else, great. Publish that too and acknowledge that the world has changed and we need to change and keep up. But I don't think we have time to keep dawdling, and I'm so glad that Wisconsin is working on its beaver plan right now and looking forward. And I'm going to really encourage people to not just take the 10-year view, but to take the 100-year view, because the decisions we're making today will determine if we have these species in the future. I used to live in California, and they managed the Central Coast steelhead to extinction because they would not take risks. They kept protecting the old ways of managing it, and it is functionally extinct now. It probably won't come back. We don't have to follow that path, but we have to decide now which path we want to follow. So that's the long-winded beaver spiel, and I thank you for listening to it, and I'm happy to answer any questions people have. I know a lot about beavers, and I'll tell you when I don't know